beautiful souls. The topic sex and spirituality is so complex, so diverse, and it's so full of judgment. And because in the past of humanity it has been so full of judgment, it requires a great deal of compassion to enter this topic from a position of wisdom, not from a position of condemnation. Therefore, today I speak to you not as a moral institution, but as someone who understands the practices of Tantra, who understands the physics of using sexual energy for ascension. I do not have an interest in any moral statements in this way, where I say, these and these people, they should feel ashamed of themselves for what they practice. This is not so. I will only make statements of fact in the same way that we can say the sun rises in the morning and goes down in the evening. But the statement of facts will describe certain divine laws and physics, but I will detach myself or remove myself from the idea of moral judgment. With giving this disclaimer, I feel confident that we can explore this topic together. This topic is indeed of great significance because there's a lot of misunderstanding and superstition around sexual energy and spiritual practice. So why don't we get right to it? I made some notes to keep this coherent and so there are key points that you can follow in order to make this complex topic more understandable. So first of all, why do I say I approach this topic from a perspective of discernment and not from a perspective of moral judgment? Yeah. So for example, if a rocket has to escape gravity, there are certain laws this rocket needs to follow in order to escape gravity. But if the rocket doesn't escape gravity, we're not going to go after the rocket and say, you are very bad and evil rocket for not being able to escape gravity. So we just focus on the physics and the nature of it without adding the idea of morality or wrong and right to it. So what I want to address first and foremost, that in society there's a lot of talk about the topic of identity. And there's a lot of talk about gender identity and sexual identity. I want to make it very clear that all identities are temporary, they come and go, and they cannot be source of true identity because true identity does not come and go. Any monk and yogi who will reach a state of practice where they attain samadhi, that means union with God, where their sense of individual self falls away, will notice the ground of reality is always there, is beyond time, and is not based on body identity or psychological identity or sexual identity. It is far beyond that. So every time we settle for some sort of self-description, some sort of psychological conceptual identity, we actually limit ourselves in understanding who we truly are. So all identities are temporary from the perspective of Buddhist practice and therefore do not represent truth. And if you place your so-called identity there in temporary objects, well then of course suffering will arise because you will figure out, well, these identities come and go. So they do not persist. Yeah, and whatever identity we place in the body, when it starts aging, even that identity will fade away. So let's leave it at that for this moment, for the idea about identity. Now, huge issues have arisen in mainstream religious and spiritual institutions when it comes to sexual energy. A great misunderstanding around the topic of sexual energy. Well, of course, I'm going to use this not because I have some sort of gripe with the church, which I don't, but it's simply that the church as a public institution, the Catholic Church, is well documented. and therefore it serves as an example. Yeah? Not in a way that I want to point out the church specifically, because all these issues will also exist in other religions and in other disciplines. They're just more well known through, let's say, the public court cases and so on. So with regards to the Catholic Church, many issues have been well documented, not only around the cases, of course, of pedophilia, homosexuality within the church, priests not following the principle of celibacy but having lovers on the side, and many, let's say, not publicly acknowledged children, but the church pays for these children because they know it's a reality that this is simply going to happen. But why are all these things happening? Why is pedophilia occurring? Why is homosexuality occurring in the church? Why do all these priests, or not all these priests, why do some priests have affairs? Well, simply because, spiritually speaking, there's a missing link for the Catholic Church. And the missing link is the proper yoga of how to transmute sexual energy. And if you don't know how to transmute sexual energy will be compulsive. So when sexual energy starts accumulating into the lower abdomen, at some point it demands release, yeah, through orgasm. But if you now have a spiritual ideal that says, oh, you shouldn't orgasm, you shouldn't masturbate, or you shouldn't have a lover, then of course there's an ego construct of I'm a spiritual man, I'm past the material world, and then there comes a suppression of the sexual energy, which means the sexual energy accumulates even more. And then it will come out in an unconscious way, in a dysfunctional neurotic way, either as a fetish, as a perversion, yeah, or whatever type or form or shape it takes. So the suppression of sexual energy obviously cannot be the answer. And many mainstream religious institutions have failed in that regard because they have morally condemned sexual energy. So the science of how to actually transmute sexual energy is not studied in those religions. So obviously, if there is an egoic dogma, yeah, sexual energy is gonna let's say, make you descend into hell if you give into that, or you betray God if you give into that, then of course there is a huge pressure on the individual to control their sexual energy and keep their sexual energy in check. But if you think of the example, for example, of a river, if a river comes down from a mountain, it will seek its path, right? And if there is a boulder, for example, that blocks the river, then the river will find another direction. So it means, for example, if the sexual energy is not released in a healthy way, it will be released in an unhealthy way because the energy will find its path. And in order to address this, one would need to understand the science of yoga around sexual energy. So obviously shadow expression cannot be the answer. And this, let's say, this grip that the Catholic Church had in Europe for centuries over the whole thought construct of sexual energy, this like control that they exercised, where many sexual acts were condemned and would be considered evil, led to people then suppressing their energy and living it out secretly, yeah? In the shadows, so to speak. And in the shadows is a good hint, because if we address this from the perspective of Jungian psychology, so based on the famous psychiatrist Carl Gustav Jung, C.G. Jung, as you Americans know it and you British folks know him. So if we address it from the idea of a shadow perspective, what does it mean? So energy that is not in the open, that is not authentically expressed, enters the shadows. That means the subconscious part of our psyche, or the unconscious part, which means a part of our soul is pressed down, so it cannot be consciously observed, and it is replaced by ego. But it's still there, so this energy that is like a river running down the mountain will find its pathway. And if it doesn't find its pathway in a conscious, healthy, integrated way, it will find its pathway first by countering the shadow suppression with shadow expression. In a way, we know this in society as a way of gaining a certain degree of impulse control. When, for example, a child plays a violent video game, instead of fighting the bully in the schoolyard, the energy is being subliminated through the act of playing a violent video game, or, for example, listening to metal music or whatever it is, watching a horror movie, in order to give the shadow some form or space of expression so it doesn't become dysfunctional. However, the difficulty with this type of coping strategy is that the shadow will always re-arise. So you have to continue the coping strategy. The coping strategy cannot end. So then there comes an addiction, for example, to entertainment, to pornography, to certain type of expressions that then need to happen on a regular basis. Because imagine there's a pot that is cooking on the stove, and the water pressure is increasing, and you have to let go of the lid, otherwise it cooks over, right? To prevent the overcooking. And this is the continuous having to cope with the energy arising through shadow expression. So the answer to shadow expression is indeed shadow integration. That means doing the investigation of knowing where does the shadow energy come from, what have I suppressed because of trauma. And this can be childhood trauma, this can be past life trauma. There are many layers to trauma. But trauma has a bad reputation. Trauma is often seen as something negative, when trauma is in truth a representation of divine lessons that we refuse to take. And because we refuse to take this divine lesson, and we refuse to learn, the lesson turned into what we call a traumatic experience. So then if we do the investigation of the trauma, and we find, for example, that at some point when we go really deep in our spiritual practice, this can also come out during hypnosis, for example. But when we find out fetishes and kinks and sexual identities are born out of trauma, and we come to an understanding of that, then with a combination of the right transmutation, yoga of sexual energy, these type of so-called sexual identities and gender identities do actually fade away. But what we need to be incredibly careful here is to stay in a compassionate attitude, because there were many attempts from religious institutions and conservative institutions that try to weaponize, for example, the idea of psychological reprogramming or reconditioning against people who had homosexual tendencies, for example. And this added more violence, this added more intolerance, and therefore it actually entrenched the issue instead of healing it. Now, am I saying you cannot have a homosexual lifestyle? No, I'm absolutely not saying that. But what I'm saying is that all sexual expressions of such nature are temporary and they're not truly who we are. But let's slowly get into that. So then, the suppression of sexual tendencies, which was clearly then discovered, for example, in Vienna around the beginning of the last centuries by Sigmund Freud, there was a realization if sexual energy is suppressed, it develops into neurosis, that means mental illness, or as he called it with regards to women in some areas where he said, oh, it develops into some sort of hysteria. But of course, his understanding was also limited. So we do understand there is this energy flow and it keeps building up and it cannot be suppressed, because suppression leads either to mental illness if it's done internally and then comes out as a dysfunctional form of sexual distorted energy, which we could call a perversion. Or it's suppressed from the outside through some sort of society standard, and it will have a similar effect and it will be experienced as violent by the individual. So reprogramming people against their will, put them into some sort of system of reprogramming, is a form of violence. And this needs to be understood. Sexual expression, the same as religious expression, should not be controlled by any institution of morality or the state. because shadow expression is always healthier than shadow suppression. So then, of course, humanity, because sexual energy was suppressed for such a long time, is now dealing with new types of difficulties, because now we think, okay, sexual expression, we associate that with freedom as a society. So we normalize all types of sexual expression, because before the suppression didn't seem normal, this was dysfunctional. But we do not understand that even these sexual expressions are temporary states of consciousness that ought to end up in integration and transmutation. But now humanity is trying to form these into more than temporary identities, which is also a misunderstanding. But if that is being said in public, it's now being understood by those who are easily offended as some sort of attack, which it isn't. Again, I'm just speaking of the physics of it. All right. So we have addressed the issue with conservative institutions and the church. So what I will say that even in Buddhist practice, there are many, many instances where the suppression of sexual energy has, for example, led to pedophilia, or where, for example, an elder monk would sexually abuse younger monks or children monks who are in the monastery when unobserved. So I want to be very clear, no religious institution is free of this. So even though at the core, religious institution understood that giving into sexual urges is not the answer, they did not necessarily have the answer. So they just got stuck with suppression, which left us with a lot of, let's say, psychological fallout that we nowadays have to deal with. So then, as a helpful understanding, celibacy, for example, can be a result of spiritual practice, but it cannot be imposed on somebody who has not mastered the yoga of sexual energy transmutation. Because what happens if we practice the proper tantra? And what do I mean by proper tantra? There are meditation techniques, they exist in Tibetan Buddhism, they exist in certain yogic systems in India. And these type of meditation techniques have to do with the breath and the visualization of energy that lead to the transmutation of sexual energy by moving the sexual energy up into higher energy centers, and then actually the sex drive goes away. So the compulsive need for masturbation or sexual action completely goes away. This is something that Western psychologists also do not understand. When, for example, Jordan Peterson speaks about it and he says, oh, sex drive is compulsive. This is not true. With the proper yoga, sex drive ceases to be compulsive and it becomes optional. It can be turned on and off through the redirection of sexual energy. So then, celibacy can be a result of spiritual practice, but it cannot be enforced on people because it will lead again to shadow suppression, which then would lead to a dysfunctional form of shadow expression that is violent and distorted and perverted in nature. I hope this makes sense to you. All right. So, the difficulty that we have nowadays is because of the fallout of what religious institutions have done, the violence that they have done to the population, is that now we deal with a lot of porn addiction. Now, when you think, for example, of being raised in a Catholic school and a teenager is being punished for masturbating by a nun or whatever, this seems such an ancient remnant and such a misunderstanding of things, and so not the right things of approaching this matter. However, the religious institutions are not entirely incorrect. If we give into sexual urges without limitation, if we live every kink, if we get obsessed with porn, if we get obsessed with masturbation, what happens is, what we need to understand is that sexual energy is also of a psychic nature. So every time we release sexual energy, it releases a sort of vibration that can be picked up on the lower astral realm. And in the lower astral realm are many dark entities that, even from, let's say, a religious perspective, could be called demonic entities that feed off sexual energy and sexual energy releases in the collective. And that means, for example, that those who are porn addicted or given into certain fetishes, like for example, sadomasochism, that they don't understand that every time they release these type of energies through their practices, that it attracts dark entities into their life. And it will make them hooked on these type of practices, because these entities will give you impulses to act on these type of ideas and sexual fetishes. They will plant these in your head. And especially if you watch a lot of porn, they will trigger these porn images in you, so you can get into that sexual addiction loop that they can feed off. And because they steal energy, of course, they want you to keep being addicted to certain practices. Yeah, and again, I'm just describing the physics of it. I'm not giving a moral judgment here. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it or you should do it. What I'm saying is the physics of it is simply this. Our sexual energy naturally rises from the root chakra up through the lower abdomen, and this is when we feel, for example, the need for sexual release, when it starts accumulating below the navel and in the sexual centers that are a little bit above the navel, to the left and to the right. This is where sexual energy accumulates, and you will feel it as a sort of psychic pressure. So if you don't know then how to guide the sexual energy upwards to release the psychic pressure, of course the only way of answering that is orgasm, a sexual release. But then if you get into this loop, what will happen, the sexual energy cannot rise and will constantly be intercepted below the solar plexus in the lower abdomen through sexual release activity. And that means you cannot accumulate spiritual energy to rise past the lower astral realm. And this is exactly what the demonic wants. It wants you to be stuck in the lower astral realm, so you can keep giving them energy and you cannot touch the heavenly dimensions. And that's why in any proper tantric system, we start moving the energy at some point into the pineal gland in the brain, where it leads to a sort of sexual stimulation, but it's not a pleasure thing, and it's not a high in the way that your current ego might believe to understand it. It has to do with creating a fertilization of the mind that leads to the mind being, how to find the right word here, the mind being fused with what we could call the Holy Spirit or the heavenly dimensions that are of a higher frequency, and it bypasses the astral realm. And that is important to understand if we seek spiritual freedom. And again, it's just the physics of it. No moral judgment here. So what I would also like to address is that sexual expression is not the goal of life. It is a temporary thing that is necessary for the soul. It is part of healing and self-discovery and integration. But it's a temporary state, and it's not the goal of life. But our egos will trick us in believing, for example, getting the dream job is the goal of life. Getting that house that you always wanted is the dream of life. Having your sexual fantasies to be fulfilled is the goal of life. But this is actually not so. These are temporary stages of consciousness that we move through to learn certain lessons about energy and creation, and to then transcend them. So if we're looping in the addiction cycle, we cannot get past it. And that means we're trapped. So it's important to understand on a spiritual level, if you exercise certain practices, if you, for example, if you attack your body psychologically because of gender dysphoria, for example, which, for example, it can be a spiritual lesson, because we reincarnate, and there are some souls who have more female incarnations than they have male incarnations, so they have a preference in the body. But maybe, for example, if you had more female incarnations and you are in a physical body of a male, you would say, oh, I'm in the wrong body. But maybe it's time to learn the lessons of the male perspective. But if we then become hostile towards that, we say, oh, we have to mutilate the body to turn it into a woman so we can stand ourselves. So it is the resistance to the spiritual lessons that lead to the expression of sexual fetishes. And in my experience, for example, with beings who have homosexual expressions, when some of them come to me for advice and ask about certain experiences, when we do investigation in the matter, a lot of these human beings who have homosexual tendencies, for example, they have rape experiences, either as a child or in past life experience where when they had a male body and they were raped by another male. And this then starts formulating as a sexual fetish in another lifetime where they feel attracted in a male body to other males. And the interesting question is, why does this happen, right? Why would we sexualize something that is actually traumatic and turn it into a pleasure addiction? That's a very fascinating question. And again, let's not see it from a moral perspective. Let's just look at the physics of the energy of it. Well, sexual energy is a union energy. If it's misunderstood by the ego, it's dispersed horizontally in space-time through orgasm into the idea of pleasure and self-gratification. But the sexual energy actually wants to rise in the same way the kundalini in the spine wants to rise. These are fusion energies where they want to come into union with the divine, but for that they need to fuse with the higher energy centers. So if we have a trauma in the lower energy centers, for example, below the solar plexus or in the lower abdomen, if there is a trauma experience there of rape, sexual torture, let's say experience with the same gender, if there are traumatic experiences around that, experiences of pedophilia, either as a predator or as a victim. Why do I make air quotes right now? Because everybody has been a predator and everybody has been a victim. Most of you have been so long on planet Earth that you've taken all these roles, and to escape these roles we need to get past the judgment and understand it on a level of compassion and on a level of energy. So the sexual energy wants to rise, but then it touches the trauma, which is a dense energy that traps you to the lower astral realm. And when that energy touches the trauma, that energy enters your mind as a sexual fantasy, for example, but it's actually a trauma recreation. People who practice sadomasochism, for example, they are doing constant trauma recreations where they replay the original injury. And why do they do this? Because subconsciously they actually want to come into a state of union, and they try to integrate that experience by turning it into something loving, into something joyful, into something that they actually can turn into an experience that ends on a high instead of a trauma. But even that is temporary. The energy wants to rise even further, first into the heart and later into the pineal gland. But every time we hit those traumas with our sexual energy, and now they come up as sexual fantasies, if we respond with orgasm, if we respond with reconditioning it over and over and over, we're trapped in the loop, so the energy never gets past it. But the actual intention of the energy is to bring these experiences into integration. And if we then do the proper shadow work, we found out what the trauma is, and we come into a state of forgiveness with regards to our victim perspective, with regards to the predator perspective, and come to a compassionate understanding why people are doing this. Well, it's very simple. Those who have had the experience of being a victim to a perpetrator, when they can't forgive the perpetrator, they keep the perpetrator's energy or perspective in the system, and they reenact it and reenact it and reenact it until they can forgive it within themselves and do the proper yoga, and then the energy transmutes and the sexual urges will drop away. Is this practice easy? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. It is one of the hardest yogic practices because the sexual urge in human beings is very strong. And that is why it requires a tremendous compassion to understand that those who attempt to free themselves from certain sexual compulsions, that even with proper guidance, the proper practice, the right method, they might still not succeed in this current lifetime. So then, let's withdraw the judgments, look at the energy objectively, and arrive at a position of compassion and wisdom. But for those who want to, for example, overcome porn addiction, who want to heal certain traumas that have led to sexual fetishes that they feel, right now, it causes more suffering than pleasure. Like I'm trapped in this loop, and then it might create problems in my relationship and so on. Those of you who want to overcome these challenges, proper methods exist. And if you develop the willpower to apply these methods, yes, we can transcend sexual energy. That does not mean that marriage is wrong. That does not mean that sleeping with your wonderful partner is wrong. But what it means is to remove the distortions from sexual energy to achieve proper, authentic connection. And then, aside from sexual union with your partner, that can also be part of a celebration of a spiritual union. Aside from that, it is important to not waste sexual energy outside of the relationship through porn addiction, fetishes, or other activities. I will leave it at that for today. This is much to contemplate and it's not an easy topic. And I understand some of you will feel happy that this topic is addressed in public, because not many spiritual teachers are willing to do that because it's such a hot plate to touch. But there will also be those who will be offended because they have placed their limited identity in something that is temporary. Contemplate about that, my friends. Thank you for listening. Be well.